The young man walked into the courtroom with the hesitant steps of someone who wasn't sure if he was allowed to exist in a place like this, his shoulders hunched inward as if every invisible weight from his past had settled there at once. The bailiff called his name, but he didn't lift his head. Instead, he clutched that folded sheet of music against his chest with trembling fingers, gripping it so tightly that the paper edges bent into the shape of his hand. Judge Caprio watched him for a long moment, the same way he observes people who enter with storms behind their silence. Because this boy wasn't giving attitude, wasn't challenging authority. He was holding his breath like the air itself might break him. The gallery shifted uncomfortably. A few whispered that he looked arrogant, or maybe rude, because he still hadn't answered a single word. But the judge leaned slightly forward, noticing the tiny details others missed. The shallow, uneven breathing, the way the boy's jaw tightened every time someone spoke, and the faint vibration in his left hand, like he was trying to hold back a memory that threatened to rise. "Young man," the judge finally said gently, "you're safe here, you can look up." And it was that invitation, simple, soft, fatherly, that made the boy slowly lift his eyes. For a split second his gaze revealed something raw and unprotected, the unmistakable look of someone who had lived through too much in too little time. Not defiance. Not disrespect. Just a silent prodigy who hadn't spoken yet, because some stories don't begin with words. They begin with the struggle to even say a first sentence. When the judge asked him to explain the violations on the ticket, the boy opened his mouth, but no sound came, only a shallow inhale that seemed to catch halfway up his throat. His fingers tightened even more around the sheet of music, as though the paper itself was the only anchor keeping him from drifting into panic. Judge Caprio didn't rush him. He simply waited with the quiet patience that comes from knowing that some people need time to unclench their fears before they speak. The courtroom, however, was not as generous. A man in the back sighed loudly, another whispered, "What's wrong with this kid?" And those subtle reactions made the boy's shoulders flinch, as if the sound of judgment was louder than any gavel. The judge raised a calming hand toward the gallery. "Let's give him a moment," he said with a firmness that didn't need volume. Then he turned back. "Take your time, son." The boy swallowed hard and tried again. I didn't mean to," he whispered, the words barely audible, thin and fragile, like they had to fight through years of silence to reach daylight. His voice cracked mid-sentence, and his eyes darted down to the floor, ashamed of the trembling he couldn't control. The judge softened his tone. "You didn't mean to what?" That single question made the boy's breath stutter, and in that tiny break, the judge noticed something the others hadn't. The corner of the sheet of music was wet, not from rain or spill, but from a tear that must have fallen long before he entered the room. Whatever brought him here today wasn't about a ticket. It was about a story buried so deep he hadn't decided whether the world deserved to hear it yet. The judge leaned back slightly, studying the boy with the careful eyes of someone who has learned that the truth often hides behind the smallest gestures rather than the loudest explanations. "When you're ready," he murmured, giving space instead of pressure. The boy's breathing grew uneven again, and he blinked rapidly as if trying to push back a memory that kept invading without permission. He lifted the sheet of music just enough for the judge to notice the creases, the faded pencil markings, the way certain notes had been circled again and again with obsessive precision. This wasn't just paper, it was history, identity, maybe even the last piece of someone he'd lost. "I didn't mean to leave the car there," he finally whispered, his voice shaking more than before. "I didn't know where else to go." The judge's face softened with understanding, not because the explanation made sense yet, but because the boy spoke like someone who lived on the edge of collapse. "Where were you coming from?" the judge asked quietly. The question seemed simple, routine, yet it hit the boy like a hit of cold wind. His fingers twitched, and for the first time he looked up directly, his eyes red-rimmed but determined. "The shelter was full," he said, the words spilling out too quickly, like he'd been holding them in for weeks. "They told me to come back in the morning, so I slept in my car." A wave of murmurs swept through the room, but this time the judge silenced them with a single raised hand. The boy lowered his eyes again, embarrassed, ashamed, already bracing for judgment. Instead, Judge Caprio's voice softened further. "Son, why didn't you tell the officer that?" The boy shook his head slightly, barely noticeable, and whispered the kind of answer that explained everything and nothing at the same time. "Because I just didn't want anyone to look at me the way they look at me now." Judge Caprio let the silence stretch, not as a punishment but as a gentle cushion, giving the boy room to breathe after exposing a truth he clearly wasn't prepared to share. The gallery had shifted from irritation to uneasy sympathy, their postures softening now that the fog around him was beginning to clear. The boy kept rubbing his thumb along the edge of the folded sheet of music, a repetitive motion that looked less like a habit and more like a coping mechanism, something practiced after long nights of trying to quiet thoughts that refused to settle. "How long have you been staying in your car?" the judge finally asked, careful to make the question neither sharp nor invasive. The boy hesitated, his lower lip trembling before he bit down to steady it. "A few months," he whispered. It wasn't the kind of answer that shocked with volume. It shocked with the humility in which it was delivered, like someone confessing to a crime that wasn't actually wrong but felt humiliating to admit. A woman in the back covered her mouth, visibly shaken, while another shifted her purse as if suddenly aware of how much she'd taken her own stability for granted. The judge nodded slowly. "And school?" he asked. The boy stiffened again, tensing as though the question reopened a wound. "I stopped going," he murmured. "Couldn't keep up, after." His voice trailed off, swallowed by memories he still wasn't ready to unpack. But the judge didn't push. He'd spent decades learning the difference between a door that's locked and a door that's simply not ready to open. Instead, he asked something softer. "The paper you're holding, is that important to you?" The boy's fingers froze. A flash of something, grief, longing, fear, moved across his expression before he tucked the sheet closer to his chest. "It's all I have left," he said, and the way he said it made even the hardwood benches seem to exhale. The judge didn't look at the ticket anymore. His eyes were fixed on the boy's hands, noticing how they curled protectively around that worn sheet as though letting it go might unravel whatever fragile balance he was clinging to. "Tell me about it," he said gently, not demanding, simply inviting. The boy's breath hitched, and for a moment he looked like he might shut down again, retreating behind that heavy silence he carried like armor. But something in the judge's tone, steady, patient, profoundly human, eased a small part of the tension in his shoulders. He unfolded the paper with slow, reverent movements, revealing handwritten musical notes, margins filled with tiny pencil markings and symbols. Even from the bench, the judge could see that the page had been handled countless times, edges softened by use and grief. "My mom wrote this," the boy whispered, the words fragile, as if saying them too loudly might erase the memory. She taught me how to play before school, after school, whenever she felt good enough." His voice thinned, breaking at the edges. "She used to say music makes heavy things lighter." The judge nodded, his expression turning solemn. "That sounds like a very wise woman." The boy swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. "She passed away last winter," he continued, his voice barely functional. "After that, I couldn't stay in our apartment. Everything sounded wrong. I stopped playing. Couldn't even touch the piano." His fingers hovered over the sheet as though afraid of damaging it. "This is the last piece she wrote before she got too weak." The courtroom was still now, not from curiosity but from the weight of understanding sinking in. Even the air felt quieter, as if honoring the moment. The judge leaned forward with quiet compassion. "You carrying that doesn't make you weak, son," he said softly. "It means you're still trying to hold on to something that mattered." And for the first time, the boy didn't look away. The boy's hands trembled slightly as he clutched the sheet, and for the first time, Judge Caprio noticed the faint scars along his wrists, subtle lines that hinted at nights spent wrestling with pain and silence. "I see," the judge said quietly, his voice neither accusatory nor judgmental, just full of quiet attention. The young man's eyes flicked up, searching for something in the judge's calm expression, and in that brief connection, he saw no mockery, no impatience, only the steady patience of someone who understood that some people speak through action, not words. "You've been carrying a lot on your own," the judge continued. The boy nodded, barely perceptible, and pressed the sheet even closer to his chest, as though sealing the weight inside. "Have you had anyone to help you?" the judge asked softly. The boy hesitated, the words hovering on his lips before vanishing back into the thick fog of silence. "No, not really," he admitted in a whisper. I didn't want anyone to see me like this." The judge nodded, acknowledging the courage it had taken just to answer. "Sometimes the hardest thing isn't what we face outside, but what we hide inside." The boy's breath caught again, and for a moment, his body relaxed slightly, as if the judge's words were a small bridge over a chasm he'd been trying to cross alone. The courtroom, meanwhile, remained quiet, the usual impatience or whispered commentary replaced by an almost tangible empathy. Even the officers at the back shifted their weight, sensing that what was happening wasn't about a ticket or a law, but about a young life trying desperately to stay upright under burdens far heavier than anyone had guessed. The boy glanced down again at the music, tracing the pencil markings with his thumb, and for the first time, it felt less like a crutch and more like a lifeline. The judge leaned forward slightly, his voice calm and fatherly as he asked, "Have you played for anyone since your mom passed?" The boy's fingers stiffened on the edges of the sheet, as if the question had scraped at something raw inside him. His eyes darted toward the piano that was just visible in the corner of the room, but then he shook his head, swallowing hard. I couldn't," he whispered. "Every time I tried, it sounded wrong. Like she wasn't there, like it was all empty." Judge Caprio nodded slowly, not interrupting, letting the silence fill the space. The courtroom, usually buzzing with impatience, held its breath. Even the officer at the side of the room leaned back slightly, as though aware that something sacred was unfolding. The boy's lips quivered, and he pressed the sheet tighter, as if trying to merge his identity with it, to protect what little remained of his connection to his mother. "Sometimes," the judge said softly, "when the world feels too heavy, the music inside us has to wait until we are ready to hear it again. That doesn't make it gone, just paused." The boy's eyes flicked up at the judge, a mixture of wonder, disbelief, and relief in his expression. He swallowed hard, his throat tight, and whispered, I thought no one would understand." The judge's gaze softened. "Son, I understand more than you know. And part of what we do here is remember that everyone deserves a chance to be seen, even if it's just one person at first." The boy nodded faintly, a tiny tremor of trust beginning to form in his posture. The sheet of music, once a shield, was slowly becoming a bridge, a fragile line between isolation and being understood. The judge's tone remained gentle as he asked, "Do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight?" The question, simple in structure, landed like a weight on the boy's chest. He hesitated, eyes darting to the floor, then back to the sheet of music that he now held almost reverently, as though it alone could answer for him. "No, the shelter is full again," he admitted quietly, his voice barely carrying over the courtroom murmurs. I don't want to bother anyone, so I just sleep in my car." The judge's brow furrowed slightly, but there was no judgment, only concern. "That must be difficult," he said softly. The boy nodded, almost imperceptibly, his lips pressed tightly together. For the first time, he let a small sigh escape, one that seemed to carry months of exhaustion, fear, and loneliness. The gallery had gone silent now, every eye on the boy, many shifting uncomfortably in their seats as they realized the distance between their lives and his. Judge Caprio's voice cut through the tension with calm authority. "Son, you're not a burden. Everyone needs help sometimes. Asking for it isn't weakness, it's courage." The boy's hand tightened briefly on the music before releasing slightly, as if tasting the idea of trust for the first time. His gaze lifted a fraction, enough for a single tear to catch the morning light filtering through the courtroom windows. He swallowed and whispered, almost to himself, I didn't know that." The judge nodded, a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones learned in a single gentle exchange, and that trust could be coaxed, block by block, word by word. Judge Caprio's eyes softened as he leaned forward and asked, "Do you play for anyone at all these days? Even in secret?" The boy's fingers froze on the folded sheet of music, tracing the worn edges with a trembling thumb. He shook his head, barely perceptible, his voice just a whisper. I stopped, after she passed." The words hung in the courtroom like fragile glass, catching the attention of everyone present. A woman in the gallery shifted, wiping a tear discreetly, while an officer at the back swallowed hard, clearly moved despite himself. The judge didn't interrupt. He allowed the silence to carry the weight. "You know," he said finally, with quiet firmness, "sometimes the music doesn't leave us, even if we stop playing. It waits for us to be ready again." The boy's lips quivered, and his eyes flicked toward the piano tucked in the corner, as though considering the possibility that he could return someday. I don't think I can," he admitted, his voice thin, nearly breaking. The judge nodded, understanding that grief isn't linear, and that recovery comes in small, often invisible steps. "Maybe you don't have to think about it all at once," he said gently. "One note, one moment, one small choice at a time." The boy's hands unclenched slightly, letting the sheet rest lightly against his chest. For the first time in the room, his posture seemed to loosen, his body unburdened, if only just a little. In that brief moment, the courtroom's usual tension softened, replaced by an unspoken empathy that needed no explanation. The boy's struggle, silent and profound, had begun to meet the quiet understanding of someone who could see beyond words. The judge paused for a moment, letting the boy's words settle in the quiet courtroom before speaking again. "Son, I want you to know that no mistake or misstep defines who you are. Sometimes, life just puts us in impossible situations." The boy's eyes flicked up, meeting the judge's gaze for a fleeting instant, unsure if he should trust this stranger who spoke so calmly yet carried such weight in his words. He swallowed, nodding slightly, his fingers brushing the edges of the music sheet, almost afraid to let go. "It's hard," he whispered, "trying to hold on to anything, when everything else feels gone." Judge Caprio nodded, leaning forward with a fatherly concern. "I understand. And holding on to this, your music, your memories, it's not just surviving, it's resisting the world's attempt to erase you." The boy's lips trembled, and a tiny exhale escaped him, one that sounded like both relief and fear intertwined. Across the room, some of the spectators shifted in their seats, realizing that this young man's story was more than a traffic ticket, it was a life teetering on the edge, fragile yet resilient. The boy's eyes darted down to the paper, tracing familiar pencil marks as though drawing strength from the memory of someone he had lost. I just didn't know anyone would care," he murmured, barely audible. Judge Caprio's voice softened even more. "Son, you're not invisible. And sometimes, it only takes one person noticing to change the course of everything." The boy blinked, a single tear tracing down his cheek, as if acknowledging for the first time that perhaps, just perhaps, he had been seen. The boy's shoulders sagged slightly, as if the weight of his solitude had lifted a fraction under the judge's gentle attention. I haven't played in months," he admitted, his voice almost breaking. "And the piano, it feels wrong now." He glanced toward the corner where the instrument rested, and his fingers twitched, betraying a longing he hadn't allowed himself to feel in weeks. Judge Caprio didn't push, simply nodded and offered. "Sometimes, music is like a friend who waits patiently, even when we walk away. It doesn't vanish, it waits until we are ready to meet it again." The boy's lips parted slightly, as though tasting the idea for the first time that he might return to it someday. His eyes flicked downward, and he took a shallow breath, as though inhaling courage from the mere suggestion. Around the courtroom, the air felt different. There was a quiet respect, a soft acknowledgement from strangers who suddenly realized the boy's journey was far more complicated than any citation or rule could convey. I thought I ruined it," he murmured, pressing the music to his chest. "That it would never sound the same without her." The judge's voice carried warmth and calm. Your memories don't erase your music, son, they become part of it. Every note you play honors her, and honors yourself. The boy blinked rapidly, a tear forming at the corner of his eye. The sheet of music, once a fragile shield, now seemed like a bridge, a connection to a past he feared he had lost, and a future he might reclaim. For a fleeting moment, the boy allowed himself to breathe a little easier, the tremor in his hands softening, and the courtroom, usually just wood and walls, seemed to hold its breath alongside him, as if waiting for the next step in his fragile, courageous journey. Judge Caprio observed the boy closely, noticing the subtle shift in his posture, the tiny relaxation in his hands as he held the music more like a talisman than a shield. "Do you want to play again one day?" he asked, his voice low and encouraging, careful not to demand more than the boy was willing to give. The boy's eyes flicked up briefly, then away, down at the creases and pencil marks that carried the weight of so many memories. I don't know," he admitted, his words hesitant, fragile. "It feels like I lost her, and if I play, it might feel wrong." Judge Caprio leaned slightly forward, resting his hands gently on the bench, and said softly, "Sometimes, son, grief isn't something to fix or erase, it's something to carry with you. And carrying it doesn't mean you have to stop living, or stop creating. Music can hold the space for both loss and hope." The boy's fingers shifted slightly on the sheet, a subtle tremor revealing that the words were reaching him, that some tiny part of him dared to imagine trying again. Around the courtroom, spectators remained hushed, sensing the significance of the moment, the quiet truth unfolding in real time. The boy's lips moved slightly, forming a whisper almost too soft to hear. I think I want to try." The judge offered a small nod, encouraging yet patient. "That's all anyone can ask, son. One small step, one note at a time." And in that pause, the boy let himself inhale fully, the first deep breath he had taken in months, as if acknowledging that even amidst loss, there could be a thread of possibility, a fragile but real beginning. The boy's gaze lingered on the corner piano, as if seeing it for the first time in months, and his fingers twitched nervously along the edges of the sheet of music. Judge Caprio watched carefully, recognizing the tension in each small movement, the hesitation that spoke louder than any words could. "It's okay to be afraid," the judge said softly. "But fear doesn't have to stop you. It's part of the journey, not the destination." The boy's lips parted slightly, a shaky inhale signaling the storm of emotions trapped inside him. I haven't touched it since she passed," he admitted, voice barely audible, trembling with a vulnerability so raw that the courtroom air seemed to thicken. The judge nodded, maintaining his calm, patient presence, and added, "Then maybe today isn't about playing perfectly. Maybe it's about letting yourself sit with it again slowly." The boy's eyes flickered up, meeting the judge's for a brief second, and in that fleeting exchange, he felt a measure of trust forming, fragile but undeniable. His hands relaxed just a fraction on the sheet of music, the tight grip loosening as he considered the possibility of reconnecting with the notes that carried his mother's memory. Across the room, spectators leaned in quietly, the usual fidgeting replaced with a shared tension, an empathy that mirrored the silent bond forming between judge and boy. "One note, son," the judge whispered. "One note at a time. You don't have to do more than that." The boy blinked rapidly, swallowing against the lump in his throat, and for the first time, allowed himself a brief, tentative hope that maybe the music, and a part of himself, hadn't been lost forever. The boy's trembling fingers lingered over the folded sheet, and he exhaled slowly, as if the simple act of opening up had drained months of tension from his body. Judge Caprio observed him quietly, recognizing that the young man was teetering between retreat and revelation, each small gesture carrying the weight of experience far beyond his 19 years. "You know," the judge said softly, "sometimes the bravest thing isn't the grand gesture, it's showing up, even when you feel like you don't belong." The boy's eyes flicked up briefly, shimmering with a mixture of disbelief and relief, then returned to the sheet as if drawing courage from it. I didn't think anyone would understand," he whispered. The judge leaned forward, his tone warm yet steady. I understand, and more importantly, you're here. That means you're willing to try, and that's a start. The courtroom, usually buzzing with low murmurs, remained silent, caught in the gravity of the moment. The boy's lips pressed together, his jaw tight with effort, yet a subtle shift in his posture suggested the first flicker of trust, fragile and new. It's just so much, he admitted, voice barely audible. The music, the memories, the places I've had to sleep, it all feels heavy. Judge Caprio nodded, offering no judgment, only acknowledgement. Carrying that weight alone is exhausting. But here in this room, you don't have to carry it alone. One note, one breath, one moment at a time. The boy exhaled again, longer this time, letting the tension slip slightly from his shoulders. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that being seen and understood didn't have to hurt, it could heal, even if just a little. The judge's calm presence seemed to anchor the boy, his words flowing not as commands but as gentle reminders that the courtroom could be a place of understanding, not just judgment. Son, Judge Caprio said softly, you've carried more than anyone should at your age. You've survived months of uncertainty, nights without safety, and yet you're still standing. That's remarkable. The boy's hand tightened briefly on the music sheet, his knuckles whitening, and he exhaled shakily, as if releasing some of the tension he had held for too long. I didn't think anyone would notice, he whispered, voice small, wavering with a mixture of shame and relief. The judge nodded, leaning slightly closer, his eyes kind but direct. Noticing is the first step. Understanding is next. And from here, it's about taking small steps forward, not giant leaps. The boy's gaze drifted toward the piano in the corner, his fingers tracing invisible patterns over the worn paper, imagining the notes echoing again after months of silence. The spectators remained quiet, the usual chatter replaced by a collective empathy that hung in the air like a soft weight. Do you want to try? The judge asked gently. The boy's lips trembled as he considered the question, his mind racing between fear and longing. I think I do, he finally admitted, barely audible, the words carrying a tentative hope that had long been buried. Judge Caprio's face softened with a reassuring smile. Then that's enough for today, son. Enough to begin. For the first time in the courtroom, the boy's posture seemed less defensive, more open, and the weight of the past months felt slightly lighter, as if being seen had begun to lift part of the burden he had carried alone for too long. The boy's hands hovered over the sheet of music, trembling slightly, as if the simple act of touching it again required courage he had spent months building. Judge Caprio watched him closely, sensing the internal struggle, the fear of failure, the anxiety of judgment, and the weight of memories tied to every note. You know, the judge said softly, sometimes the hardest step isn't playing the music perfectly. It's letting yourself feel again, even if it hurts. The boy blinked rapidly, swallowing against a lump in his throat, and whispered, I'm scared I'll mess it up, that it won't be the same. Judge Caprio nodded knowingly. It won't be the same, and that's okay. It will be yours now, carrying both what was lost and what you can create. The boy exhaled slowly, a small shiver running through his body, but his fingers stayed on the sheet. Across the courtroom, spectators leaned in quietly, sensing the gravity of the moment, their usual fidgeting replaced with attention and empathy. He lifted his gaze toward the judge, eyes glistening with tears he had tried to hide for months. I think I can, he whispered, his voice barely audible, yet carrying more determination than anyone had expected. The judge offered a reassuring nod, his calm presence a steady anchor. Then do it, son. Just one note at a time. That's all you need to begin. The boy's hand shifted slightly, trembling less now, and he pressed the paper to his chest for a heartbeat longer, gathering courage from the memories it held, and for the first time in months, allowed himself to imagine a moment where fear and hope could coexist without breaking him. The boy's hands slowly relaxed on the music sheet, and he lifted his gaze, meeting Judge Caprio's calm eyes. For the first time, there was a spark of quiet determination in his expression, a subtle shift from fear to cautious courage. I think I want to try playing again, he whispered, his voice fragile but steady enough to reach the judge, the bailiff, and the hushed courtroom alike. Judge Caprio nodded gently, acknowledging both the courage it took and the significance of this small step. That's all anyone can ask of you, the judge said, his voice soft but firm, carrying the weight of years spent guiding those who struggled silently. The boy's fingers brushed the edge of the sheet again, tracing faint pencil marks as if drawing strength from the memories they held. Across the gallery, the spectators were silent, the usual restlessness replaced by empathy. They were witnessing not just a traffic case, but a young life standing at the edge of healing. It doesn't have to be perfect, Judge Caprio added. Just begin, and let the rest follow in its own time. The boy exhaled slowly, nodding minutely, the tremor in his hands easing, replaced by a tentative steadiness. For a fleeting moment, it was as if the courtroom itself leaned in, holding space for him, recognizing the fragile courage it took to face the piano again, to honor both loss and memory. His lips pressed against the paper, almost as if blessing it, and then, ever so carefully, he allowed himself to imagine the sound of the first note, untainted by expectation, a bridge between past grief and future possibility. The judge's gaze lingered, warm and understanding, as the boy's journey of courage began its quiet but profound first step. The courtroom held its collective breath as the boy slowly unfolded the sheet of music, his fingers tracing the pencil marks with a tenderness that spoke volumes about his connection to both the music and his mother's memory. Judge Caprio remained calm, leaning slightly forward, exuding the quiet authority of someone who understood that the most profound moments often unfold in silence. You don't have to do it all at once, he said softly. One note, one sound, one heartbeat at a time. The boy nodded faintly, his lips pressed together as he swallowed against the lump in his throat, a tremor still running through his hands but easing with each passing second. He glanced toward the piano, its polished wood gleaming subtly in the corner, and hesitated, the weight of months of grief pressing against him. Then he lifted his fingers just above the keys, taking a deep, shaky breath, as if the very act of beginning required all the courage he had stored inside him. The spectators remained hushed, some leaning forward, captivated by the vulnerability and bravery of a life slowly emerging from silence. I think I can, he whispered again, barely audible, but this time stronger, steadier. Judge Caprio nodded, a quiet smile forming, signaling both understanding and encouragement. Then begin, son. The world doesn't need perfection, it needs honesty. The boy's eyes glistened as he pressed the first key, a tentative note that wavered but held promise, a bridge from sorrow to resilience, and the courtroom seemed to exhale collectively, witnessing a transformation that went far beyond a simple act of music. The first note hung in the courtroom, trembling in the quiet like a fragile heartbeat, and the boy's eyes widened as if surprised he had found the courage at all. Judge Caprio leaned slightly forward, his expression calm, patient, and full of quiet pride, allowing the moment to stretch without interruption. The boy's fingers hovered above the keys again, then pressed another note, slightly more confident, as though the act of playing was slowly stitching together pieces of a fractured past. Each note carried memories of his mother, the months of fear, and the nights in his car, transforming them into something tangible, something he could hold in his hands. The spectators, silent until now, began to lean forward, captivated not by perfection but by the raw honesty that emanated from the young man's tentative performance. The trembling lessened slightly with each key, and a tiny smile, almost imperceptible, crept across his face, as if acknowledging that he was capable of creating beauty from pain. Judge Caprio's voice, gentle and fatherly, broke the silence. See, son? Every note matters, and you're not alone in carrying them. The boy exhaled deeply, a mix of relief and tentative pride, pressing the keys with growing confidence, each sound a declaration that despite loss, fear, and months of isolation, he could still move forward. By the final note of the short piece, the courtroom seemed suspended in a quiet awe, the air vibrating not with judgment, but with recognition that a young life had begun to reclaim its courage and hope. As the final note lingered in the courtroom, a profound silence followed, heavier and more meaningful than any words could convey. The boy's fingers rested gently on the keys, trembling slightly but no longer with fear. Now it was anticipation, a fragile hope slowly growing. Judge Caprio leaned forward, his eyes warm, calm, and filled with a quiet admiration that only came from decades of seeing lives transform in small but powerful ways. "Son," he said softly, "today you didn't just play a song. You let yourself be seen, and that takes more courage than most can imagine." The boy blinked rapidly, a tear slipping down his cheek as the weight of months, of grief, loneliness, and fear, began to lift, if only a fraction. Across the gallery, some spectators wiped their eyes, others exchanged quiet nods, silently acknowledging the significance of the moment. The boy looked down at the sheet of music, now folded neatly in his hands, and whispered, "She would be proud, wouldn't she?" Judge Caprio smiled gently. "I think she already is. And so are we, son." For the first time, the boy straightened fully in his chair, shoulders no longer hunched in self-protection, his presence asserting that he was not defined by fear or loss, but by resilience, courage, and the willingness to try again. In a subtle twist, the officer who had issued the ticket quietly stepped forward, placing a small envelope on the bench, a scholarship for local music lessons, recognizing his talent and determination. The boy's eyes widened in disbelief, a tremor of joy overtaking him, and the courtroom felt lighter, charged with the magic of a life transformed in a single, honest moment. That day, a ticket had led not to punishment, but to understanding, hope, and a young man reclaiming his music, and himself. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit subscribe so you can see more incredible courtroom moments like this.